Listen closely. Two dates matter here. 1851. The Crystal Palace goes up like a switch turning on. 1854. The Orphan Trains begin rolling like a switch turning people into cargo. That overlap is the kind of detail history mentions separately, because together it looks like a design. And I'm not asking you to accept a wild claim. I'm asking you to follow a trail. In 1851, London built a building that looked impossible for its time. A palace made of glass and iron, thrown up in months, glowing like a machine for light. And almost at the same moment, a different kind of machine began to move across the Atlantic world. A machine that moved children. Not a few, not dozens, hundreds of thousands. Children whose names would change, whose past would blur, whose records would thin out as if they were never meant to be traced. Here's the hook. If this was just progress, why does it leave so many blank spaces where people should be? And why do the brightest, most celebrated symbols of the 1800s, glass palaces, world fairs, grand stations, iron bridges, rise right next to the darkest social reality? A generation of kids treated like inventory. This is not a fairy tale about secret labs. It's something colder. A paper reset. A system that can erase an origin with ink and print a new life with a signature. Stay with me, because once you see the pattern, you won't unsee it. Start with the shine. The Crystal Palace, a colossal hall of glass and iron, built for the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park. To the public, it was a miracle of modernity. Sunlight pouring through endless panes, machines on display, maps and diagrams, inventions that promised a clean future. But if you watch the 1800s like an investigator, the Crystal Palace is more than a building. It's a symbol of a mindset. Transparency as control. Order as spectacle. Everything measured, catalogued, labeled, placed behind glass. A world that says nothing is hidden, everything is visible. And that's the first contradiction. Because outside those bright halls, whole districts of London were living in darkness. Crowded rooms, sickness, hunger, children working like adults. The same century that sold the future as a glowing display also produced a new type of childhood. A childhood without roots. If you think I'm exaggerating, look at what cities were becoming. London exploded in population. So did New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Manchester. Railways connected regions. Factories demanded hands. Migration flooded in. And when a city grows faster than it can feed itself, something breaks. Families fracture. Illness spreads. Parents disappear into debt, prison, war, or disease. Children become street labor, selling papers, carrying coal, shining boots, sleeping in doorways, learning survival before learning names. The public called them urchins. Institutions called them cases. And the state began to treat them as a problem that could be managed. Classify, register, relocate. That's the second hook. When did a human life become something you can move like cargo? Now shift to America, because this is where the machine becomes visible. In 1854, a movement begins that sounds like charity. The Orphan Trains. Organizations like the Children's Aid Society start sending poor, abandoned, and at-risk children from eastern cities to the Midwest. The official story is hopeful. Fresh air, farms, new families, a second chance. And yes, some children truly did find safety and love. But the system itself was built like distribution. Train schedules, lists, committees, placements. And the detail people avoid saying out loud is simple. Many of these children were not true orphans, the way we imagine today. Some had one living parent. Some had relatives. Some were placed temporarily in institutions during hard times, then shipped so far away that contact collapsed. And once a child is moved across states, across communities, across languages and churches, paper becomes the only thing that remembers who he was. Before you say, "Okay, but that's just social history," let me show you why this story feels different when you put it next to the architecture of the era. The 1800s doesn't only relocate children. It builds the stage that teaches everyone what to believe. World fairs, exhibitions, temporary cities, built to look permanent, then demolished. If you've watched Tartaria content, you already know how strange that sounds. In 1893, Chicago builds the Columbian Exposition, what people called the White City. Neoclassical halls, huge domes, grand boulevards, reflecting pools, electric lights. Millions visit. And then, much of it disappears. Officially, it's temporary architecture, but psychologically, it does something permanent. It teaches the public a story. The modern world is clean, ordered, bright, and guided by planners. And it does that while the real city outside the fairgrounds is full of smoke, poverty, child labor, and chaos. That contrast matters, because it's the same pattern as the Crystal Palace, a glass cathedral of progress that hides the mess it depends on. Now place the Orphan Trains on that timeline. A child can be born in a tenement in New York, shipped to a farm in Kansas, renamed, schooled, and grown into an adult who attends a world fair in Chicago and believes he is witnessing the birth of modern civilization. He won't question what came before. He won't even know how, because his before was removed. That's why I keep calling this a paper reset. Not because there was one secret meeting, because the system created a new baseline, and once a baseline is accepted, everything that came before it becomes myth. Now let's talk about the part that makes this even darker. Selection wasn't always hidden. Some placements were public. Children were presented in halls, churches, and meeting rooms. Sometimes on stage platforms. People later called them adoption fairs. And if that phrase makes you uncomfortable, it should, because it proves the mindset. You can display a child like you display a product. Examine, choose, sign. Even when the intention was to help, the method reduced humans to traits: strong, quiet, skilled, healthy. And it creates the kind of trauma that doesn't show up in census numbers. Because trauma isn't always a broken bone. Sometimes it's the absence of an answer when you ask, "Where am I from?" Now here's something most people don't connect. The same period also expands policing and documentation. Photographs become identification tools. Fingerprints appear later. Institutions begin keeping files like factories keep ledgers. If you want to build a modern state, you need legibility. You need citizens who can be counted and located. And when you build that legibility fast, mistakes become destiny. A misspelled name becomes a new family line. A wrong birth year becomes a lifelong correction you never make. A changed religion becomes a new heritage. So when people today say, "My family history starts around 1870, that doesn't always mean nothing existed before. It can mean the chain of memory snapped. Migration, poverty, institutionalization, renaming, silence. The 19th century didn't only change economies, it changed how memory survives. Let me give you another short scene. A girl from Boston, 9 years old, placed in a charity home after her mother dies. Her father is alive, but he's injured, jobless, and unfit by the standards of the time. She is put on a list. Her name is written by someone who doesn't know her accent. A week later, she's on a train. At a stop, a family chooses her. They are kind, but they already have a daughter with the same name. So they simplify it. Years later, she tries to remember her mother's surname and realizes she can't. It's not because she forgot on purpose. It's because survival forced her to replace it. Now scale that again. This is why, in old-world storytelling, resets don't have to be dramatic. A reset can be a quiet administrative drift, a generation raised without access to its own origin, a generation trained inside new institutions, a generation taught to worship progress as the only reality. Now ask, why did the state tolerate child labor for so long, then suddenly discover moral concern? Why did charity organizations grow right when factories grew? Why did railroads become both industry and relocation system? Because infrastructure makes mass movement easy. And once movement is easy, management becomes tempting. The rail network doesn't care what it carries: coal, mail, soldiers, cattle, children, schedules, tickets, manifests. And if your society has learned to see everything as logistics, then people become logistics too. This is the part I want you to feel in your bones. The Crystal Palace is light. The orphan trains are motion. Paperwork is identity. School is programming. Put those four together, and you get a clean, modern population that fits the industrial rhythm. Not because someone invented them, because the system reshaped them. Now, I'm going to do something your audience loves. A simple 5-point pattern. 1. Bright public spectacle that sells progress. 2. Mass infrastructure expansion. Rail, telegraph, standardized time. 3. Population pressures, poverty, migration, disease. 4. Institutions that absorb the vulnerable. Workhouses, missions, orphan systems. 5. Paperwork that rewrites identity. Names, ages, origins. If you see all 5 in one era, you're not looking at random events. You're looking at a transition, a controlled transition. And here's the reason I think this belongs on your channel. Because the Tartaria niche isn't only about maps and buildings. It's about the feeling that the official story skips a step, that we jumped from old world to modern world too smoothly. This story shows a real mechanism that can create that jump, not by destroying everything, by replacing continuity, by breaking memory, by scattering bloodlines. So when someone says, "We don't know what happened before 1800, it might not be because nothing happened. It might be because the people who would remember were moved, renamed, and trained into a new narrative. That doesn't prove any single grand theory, but it gives you the most valuable thing in this niche: a plausible mechanism. And mechanisms are scarier than monsters, because mechanisms actually run. So the next time you see a photo of the Crystal Palace or the White City or a grand old station with a clock tower and endless corridors, don't only think about architecture. Ask what kind of society that architecture served. Ask what kind of people it needed. Ask what kind of children it created. And ask what it did to anyone who didn't fit. Because the 19th century didn't only build machines, it built the template for managing humans. And once that template exists, the past becomes optional. Only the present system matters. And that is the quietest kind of reset. Think about that. When your past is stored in a file, whoever controls the file controls your past. Now picture the scene that repeats again and again in accounts. A train arrives. Children step down. They stand in a line. Adults examine them: hands, teeth, back, health. The questions are practical. Is he strong? Is she obedient? Can he work? Does she fit? Some children are chosen quickly. Some are passed over. Some learn, in one afternoon that love and labor can look identical from the outside. On paper, it's called placement. In reality, it can feel like selection. And once selected, a new life begins with a new set of words, a new surname, a new religion, a new address, sometimes even a new birthday, guessed by a clerk who never met the child's mother. If you're wondering why this matters for an old world/reset channel, here's why. Because this is exactly how a reset happens without bombs, not by destroying buildings, by reorganizing people. If you inherit a world that's changing too fast, new factories, new borders, new infrastructure, the easiest way to stabilize it is to produce a population that fits the new order. Children are the easiest material to shape. They learn fast, they adapt fast, and if you remove their roots, you can plant new ones. Now go back to the Crystal Palace. Why does it sit at the center of this story? Because it's the perfect metaphor for the century's new religion, the religion of standardization. The Crystal Palace was built from repeated parts, modular iron, repeated glass panes, patterns like a factory line. And the Great Exhibition celebrated repetition, mass production, industrial systems, identical objects made by the thousands. Once a society learns to think like that, it starts to think that people can be organized the same way. Not all at once, not as a conspiracy meeting, as a drift, a slow slide of logic. You can hear it in the language of reform. Saving children, removing them from vice, placing them in wholesome homes. It sounds kind, but it also sounds like management. Now add the third piece, paperwork. The 1800s is when modern registration tightens. Birth certificates become more standardized, censuses expand, parish archives become state records, names become official. A person becomes legible to the system only when the system can write them down. And that creates a dangerous truth. If you can't be written down, you're invisible. But if you can be written down incorrectly, you become someone else. This is not a fantasy. It's the mechanics of bureaucracy. Clerks misspell surnames. Immigrants simplify names. Officials change names to fit their language. Institutions rename children to match a new church. Over time, family memory breaks. And when family memory breaks, the past becomes easier to replace with a clean story. Here's a simple test. If this was only charity, explain 3 things at the same time. First, why were children moved in such huge numbers with such thin oversight? Second, why were so many placements designed around work capacity, not only care? Third, why did the same era obsess over classification, numbering, and record control, exactly the tools that can rewrite identity? Any one of those has a normal explanation. All 3 together create a system. And systems don't need villains. They run on incentives. Factories needed labor. Farms needed hands. Cities needed fewer mouths to feed. Institutions needed funding. The state needed order. And children became the adjustable piece that made those pressures balance. Now let's add a human moment, because numbers can hide pain. Imagine a boy in New York. He knows only his first name, or he knows a surname, but it belongs to a father who vanished after an illness. He's placed in a mission house temporarily. Weeks become months. A clerk writes his name wrong. The child doesn't correct it because he's 8 and tired. Then a train takes him west. A family chooses him. They call him by a new name because the old one is too foreign or too hard. By the time he turns 15, the old name is a sound he barely remembers. By the time he becomes a man, the old city feels like a dream. Now multiply that by thousands. You don't need a laboratory to manufacture a new population. You only need distance, time, and paper. And here is where the old world vibe becomes heavy. Look at the 1800s skyline. Grand buildings appear everywhere. Courthouses, stations, schools, insane asylums, massive brick factories, iron bridges, glass halls. They look like confidence. But behind the confidence is a constant fear, disorder, crowds, disease, crime, labor, unrest, revolution. The 19th century is obsessed with one question: how do you govern mass society? And the answer it keeps choosing is the same: measure, train, standardize. That's why modern schooling explodes in this era. Fixed schedules, bells, lines, repetition. The Prussian model and similar systems spread because states need citizens who can read instructions, follow time, obey rules, and operate in industrial rhythm. School becomes more than education. It becomes identity training. For a child with weak roots, school is where the nation prints itself into the mind. Flag, heroes, history, where you belong. So you have a cycle. A child loses roots through poverty and migration. Institutions absorb him. Paper rewrites him. School engraves him. And the new society gets a person who fits the system. Again, not a cartoon villain. A machine made of many small parts. Now, does this prove a grand conspiracy? No. And I'm not asking you to believe in secret underground printers. I'm asking you to notice a pattern. When history gets uncomfortable, it gets framed as a celebration. The Great Exhibition says, "Look at progress." The Orphan Trains say, "Look at charity." The paperwork says, "Look at order." But if you stand back, you can see something else. A generation of children being redistributed to build the modern world. A generation whose origins often dissolved inside record rooms. A generation that became, in a quiet way, the human foundation of the industrial age. And once you accept that, the Crystal Palace becomes even stranger. Because that glass cathedral of progress wasn't only showcasing machines, it was teaching the public a new belief that everything can be organized, controlled, standardized, and made better, including people, including children, including memory. So here is the final question I want to leave you with. If a child's name, city, religion, and past can be changed by institutions in 1 decade, how many family histories today begin in the 1800s? Not because nothing existed before, but because the earlier links were cut. How many bloodlines were scattered not by war, but by policy, paperwork, and trains? And if that happened on such a scale, what else in the 19th century should we stop viewing as natural progress and start viewing as a controlled transition? A reset that didn't need an explosion. Only a system, only signatures, only a train leaving the station at dawn. If you want to feel how real this is, try a simple experiment. Look at family trees. How many lines go blurry around 1850 to 1900? How many surnames suddenly shift spelling? How many birthplaces become unknown right when railroads and registration systems explode? Again, none of that proves a single hidden hand, but it proves a landscape where identity was highly editable. And that's why these stories hit so hard in the old world space, because the greatest theft isn't always a building or a map. It's continuity. It's the ability of a person to say, "I know where I came from." Once that's gone, you can build any narrative on top. You can call a glass palace the start of modernity. You can call a relocation program pure charity. You can call standardization education. And the people living inside that system won't resist because they won't even know what they lost. One more detail that people overlook: the railroads even standardized time. In 1883, US rail companies adopted standard time zones so schedules could run like clockwork. That's not sinister by itself. It's logistics, but it shows the mindset of the era. Synchronize the nation, make movement predictable, make people fit the timetable. Children fit that timetable too. So, I'll leave you with one last question. If the 1800s could reshape hundreds of thousands of children with trains, paperwork, and schools, what else could it reshape without leaving a dramatic crater? And how much of what we call history is simply the version that survived the filing cabinets? This video is a narrative-driven exploration for discussion and immersive storytelling. It is not presented as verified historical fact.